The final spring of the Second World War descended upon the Austrian Alps with a kind of tense, unnatural quiet. The deceptive stillness that comes only when a collapsing empire has begun to tear itself apart from the inside. The once proud German war machine, which years earlier had thundered across Europe with unstoppable momentum, was now a fractured, bleeding giant stumbling toward its death. Roads that had once carried confident Wehrmacht columns now overflowed with retreating soldiers, deserting officers, fleeing civilians, and scattered pockets of die-hard SS units who refused to accept the war was lost. The air carried the distant rumble of artillery from the north as American armored divisions smashed through Bavaria, while from the south, French and Austrian resistance groups tightened their grip on mountain passes. Rumors flew like wildfire across the Alps, rumors of Hitler's imminent downfall, of Himmler's secret negotiations, of SS units conducting last-minute purges, and of desperate commanders ordering executions before fleeing into the mountains. It was in this maelstrom of fear, vengeance, and unraveling authority that Castle Itter stood, a medieval stone fortress perched on a rocky outcrop, overlooking the green valleys of Tyrol with the solemn stillness of a monument built to witness centuries of war, rebellion, and human folly. But the castle, which for ages had served as a defensive stronghold, now held a captive audience unlike anything in its long history. Inside its stone walls, behind barred doors and thick iron locks, sat some of France's most important political prisoners, men whose names had shaped the destiny of the French Republic long before the war shattered the map of Europe. Former French prime ministers, cabinet ministers, generals, intellectuals, and resistance icons, Paul Reynaud, Edouard Daladier, Charles de Gaulle's sister, Marie Agnes, General Maurice Gamelin, General Maxime Weygand, and several others. This bizarre collection of political rivals, military leaders, and ideological adversaries had spent the last years imprisoned together by Hitler's orders, guarded by SS units who now grew increasingly unpredictable as the Reich crumbled. Tension inside the castle was constant. The prisoners, accustomed to political maneuvering in Paris salons rather than Nazi cells, watched the world outside shift with both hope and dread. Every gunshot echoing from the valley below forced them to wonder whether salvation or execution was approaching. They knew that as the Allies pressed closer to Austria, the SS was becoming more desperate, far more likely to massacre high-value prisoners than allow them to be liberated. The castle had become a prison poised at the edge of a knife, its fate tied directly to the sanity, or madness, of the Nazi guards who still patrolled its towers. Below the castle, the surrounding villages felt the tremors of collapse as the Nazi administrative structure imploded. Wehrmacht troops, ordinary conscripts and officers who had long grown weary of pointless slaughter, were abandoning their positions in growing numbers. Many sought only to surrender to the Americans before falling into Soviet hands. Others tried to return home. Some simply disappeared into the forests. Meanwhile, the SS, driven by ideological fanaticism, launched sporadic operations against civilians, deserters, and anyone suspected of defeatism. The tension between Wehrmacht soldiers and SS units had grown into open hostility in several regions. Reports surfaced of firefights between the two German factions as they accused each other of cowardice or treason. This internal collapse created a strange battlefield landscape where alliances were no longer dictated by uniforms, but by survival. The Alps became a labyrinth of danger and opportunity, where every road could lead to safety, ambush, or chaos. Amid this collapse, Castle Itter's SS guards recognized that American forces were rapidly approaching. With their chain of command disintegrating and the possibility of being tried as war criminals looming, the guards fled the castle under cover of night, abandoning their prisoners entirely. They left behind locked gates, empty guard towers, and terrified French dignitaries, who now found themselves stranded in a medieval fortress with no way to defend themselves and no clear path to freedom. Food supplies were low. Weapons were non-existent, and the valley below swarmed with roaming SS units who would not hesitate to kill them all rather than allow them to live as symbols of Nazi defeat. In this vacuum of command, the French prisoners faced a grim choice: remain in the castle and risk execution by returning SS squads, or attempt a desperate escape into the mountains where they could easily be hunted down. But the Alps were unpredictable, and the SS still operated in scattered pockets, vindictive, leaderless, and determined to spill as much blood as possible before the end. The only hope lay in contacting the Allied forces, whose tanks and infantry were rumored to be advancing from the north. But Castle Itter was perched on a rugged cliffside, and the nearest American units were still miles away, navigating an area littered with retreating Germans. The situation was bleak, until a singular figure emerged from the chaos. Major Josef Sepp Gang, a German Wehrmacht officer disillusioned by the senseless destruction of the war and disgusted by SS brutality, made a decision that defied everything his military oath demanded. Recognizing that the SS was preparing to launch a killing spree across the region, he initiated contact with the local Austrian resistance in the town of Wurgl, offering intelligence and protection in exchange for cooperation. Gang, who had spent the war commanding artillery units, was no Nazi zealot. He was a soldier who saw the war as lost and sought only to minimize the suffering of civilians and prevent further atrocities. When he learned that Castle Itter still contained high-profile prisoners who would certainly be killed if the SS returned, Gang knew he could not let it happen. He became the unlikeliest of saviors, a German officer planning to rescue the very French statesmen his regime had imprisoned. But the Wehrmacht alone could not stand against the SS. He needed allies, real allies, and in the surreal, collapsing world of late-war Austria, his best option was a group of American soldiers advancing through the valley. At the tip of their spear was Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr., a brash, fearless tanker from the U.S. 12th Armored Division. Lee had earned a reputation as a bold commander, a man who would drive his Sherman tank into any danger zone if it meant achieving his objective. When Gang approached him with an astonishing proposal, an alliance between American troops and a group of renegade Wehrmacht soldiers to rescue French VIPs from an SS assault, Lee didn't hesitate. The line between enemy and ally had dissolved in the chaos of the Reich's final days. The mission wasn't about flags anymore. It was about stopping the SS from committing one last atrocity. And so, from the dying embers of Nazi Germany, an impossible alliance was born. American armored units, Wehrmacht defectors, Austrian partisans, and French resistance figures would converge on Castle Itter, fighting not against each other, but together, side by side, against a common enemy, the SS battalion preparing to storm the fortress. In the long, brutal history of the Second World War, with its shifting fronts, its betrayals, its horrors, and its desperate acts of courage, there would be nothing like what was about to happen at Castle Itter. For one night, uniforms would mean nothing. Old enemies would share ammunition. American tankers and German soldiers would defend the same stone walls. And inside the ancient fortress, men who had once been political rivals in France would brace for a battle that none of them could have imagined surviving. The strangest last battle of World War II was about to begin.
The strange alliance that would soon assemble at Castle Itter did not form through diplomacy, common ideology, or political agreements. It formed through desperation, collapsing command structures, and the stark clarity that comes when men facing the chaos of a dying war realize that survival depends on abandoning old loyalties. Each group, American, German, Austrian, and French, found themselves swept into a convergence that would have been unthinkable even weeks earlier. Yet as the Reich crumbled and the SS spiraled into unchecked fanaticism, old enemies became unlikely partners, united by necessity and the instinct to resist the final convulsions of a defeated dictatorship. At the center of this convergence stood Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee, Jr., a hard-charging American tank commander whose reputation for bold, borderline reckless leadership had carved his name into the fast-moving front lines of the late war. Lee understood the battlefield not through maps alone, but through intuition, through a sense of when to push, when to take risks, and when to exploit the enemy's collapsing morale. When he received the astonishing message from Major Joseph Gangl, an officer of the German Wehrmacht, requesting an alliance to defend French hostages threatened by an SS death squad, Lee felt neither hesitation nor doubt. In the dying days of the war, he had seen enough contradictions, defections, and chaos to know that the world had slipped beyond the rigid categories of enemy and ally. He recognized instinctively that this mission was not about flags or politics. It was about preventing a massacre. The men under Lee's command, a crew of American tankers and infantry from the 12th Armored Division, had spent the final phase of the war cutting through Bavaria with relentless momentum. They were hardened soldiers, men who understood the war was nearly over, but who also recognized that the last days were often the most dangerous. Retreating Germans, desperate SS detachments, and chaotic firefights made every valley and village a potential trap. When Lee relayed the plan to his men that they were to march alongside German soldiers to defend a medieval castle full of French VIP prisoners, they met the news with disbelief, then grim acceptance. War had taught them that the front line shifted with every hour, that alliances could form and dissolve instantly, that survival often required embracing the unexpected. Some wiped their rifles clean in silence. Others checked ammunition belts with mechanical focus. A few exchanged dark humor, muttering that surviving a firefight alongside Germans would make an absurd story if they lived long enough to tell it. But their faith in Lee was absolute. If he believed the mission was necessary, they would follow, no matter how strange the battlefield became. Opposite the Americans stood the Wehrmacht defectors, led by Major Gangl, a hardened artillery officer who had reached the breaking point of his loyalty to the collapsing Reich. Gangl had watched the SS terrorize civilians in Tyrol, executing deserters, hanging suspected dissidents, and preparing for a wave of final purges before fleeing into the mountains. The Wehrmacht had always held deep resentment toward the SS, whose fanaticism, political loyalty, and brutality had created a chasm within the German military. But in the closing days of the war, this resentment transformed into open hostility. When Gangl made the decision to stand against the SS and protect the civilians of Wurgel, he crossed an irreversible threshold. Each man who followed him, whether soldier, officer, or mechanic, did so knowing they would be branded traitors by the SS and executed on sight. They had no illusions about the risks. Their uniforms no longer protected them. Their oath to the Führer meant nothing. What drove them now was the simple moral refusal to allow innocent people to be slaughtered. And when they learned of the French prisoners at Castle Itter, they understood immediately that the SS, desperate, vengeful, and unrestrained, would not hesitate to massacre them as a final act of spite. Alongside Gangl and his soldiers stood the Austrian resistance fighters, men who had operated in the shadows throughout the occupation, gathering intelligence, sabotaging German equipment, and guiding deserters or refugees through the Alpine passes. These resistance members had lived for years under the constant threat of execution. They had seen their villages occupied, their families harassed or imprisoned, their neighbors executed for disloyalty. They carried a quiet, simmering rage toward the Nazi machine, and the news that SS forces were preparing to reassert control in the region filled them with urgency. When Gangl sought their cooperation, they agreed immediately, not because they trusted the German officer, but because they recognized that the SS posed a threat to everyone, regardless of national allegiance. For them, the mission to reach Castle Itter was not merely a rescue operation, It was a chance to strike a final blow at the regime that had terrorized their homeland. Inside the castle itself, the French VIP prisoners, once leaders of a powerful nation, found themselves united by circumstances far stranger than politics. These were men who in Paris would have stood on opposite sides of parliamentary battles, who had clashed over policy, ideology, or national direction. But in captivity, stripped of offices and influence, they became bound by the shared humiliation of imprisonment and the common hope of liberation. Their days had been marked by tension, arguments, boredom, fear, and speculation about the fate of France. These were men accustomed to shaping history, now helpless to influence even their own survival. When the SS guards abandoned the castle, the resulting silence was both liberating and terrifying. They were free of their captors, but trapped in a fortress perched above a valley increasingly filled with hostile forces. They had no weapons, no guards, and no means to escape. Even the simplest tasks, locking gates, patrolling courtyards, rationing supplies, fell to them. Intellectuals and politicians now found themselves acting as sentries, cooks, repairmen, and lookouts. The absurdity of the situation did not escape them. Some approached it with dignity, others with frustration. All understood that their survival depended entirely on whether Allied forces found them before the SS did. The most critical figure among the prisoners, in terms of the battle to come, was not a statesman, but a former tennis champion, Jean Borotra. Unlike the older dignitaries, Borotra possessed the athleticism, courage, and physical agility that none of the political prisoners could match. When the time came to take action, to carry messages, to slip through enemy territory, or to perform physically dangerous tasks, Borotra would emerge as an unexpected but essential hero within the castle walls. He moved with purpose, scanning the surrounding forests for signs of approaching danger, urging his fellow prisoners to prepare for the possibility of combat and volunteering for the riskiest missions. While the others waited nervously for news, Borotra embodied the restless energy of a man unwilling to die behind stone walls. As these groups moved inexorably towards each other, Americans rolling through the valley with their Sherman tank, Wehrmacht defectors navigating between SS patrols, Austrian partisans preparing ambush positions, and French prisoners fortifying the castle with makeshift defenses, the convergence took on the feel of fate rather than strategy. No single commander had designed this coalition. No treaty had been signed. No war council had approved it. It was a union forged entirely by circumstance and necessity, born in the wreckage of a collapsing empire, where moral choices were sharp, immediate, and unclouded by politics. What made this alliance extraordinary was not merely the presence of Americans and Germans fighting together, something unimaginable during the core years of the war, but the way each group recognized almost instinctively that the battlefield had changed shape. The enemy was no longer defined by nationality, uniform, or language. The enemy was any force that sought to prolong the brutality of a war already lost. And the SS, with their fanaticism and refusal to surrender, stood as the final embodiment of that brutality. To defeat them, at least in that small corner of Austria, meant transcending the old boundaries of allegiance. In the valley below Castle Itter, villagers watched with stunned confusion as American troops spoke with Wehrmacht officers, as German soldiers handed ammunition to men they had once been ordered to kill, as Austrian resistance fighters guided the coalition through the twisting Alpine roads. For civilians who had spent years trapped between fear of the Gestapo, fear of informants, and fear of Allied bombings, the sight of these forces cooperating was a moment of surreal clarity. The war had become something more unpredictable, more human, more desperate than any propaganda poster had ever suggested. And so the coalition advanced toward Castle Itter, not as allies in the traditional sense, but as a band of men who understood that the final act of the war in Tyrol would be written not by generals in distant bunkers, but by those who stood shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. Before the sun rose again over the Alps, these men,
Americans, Germans, Austrians, and French would find themselves defending ancient stone walls against a force of SS soldiers determined to kill every last prisoner inside. This was not a battle of nations. This was a battle of necessity, a battle of survival, a battle where enemies became brothers for one final stand.
the fragile alliance that had begun to form around Castle Itter did so under the looming shadow of an approaching storm, a storm not composed of weather or terrain, but of human vengeance, fanaticism, and the desperation of a collapsing regime clinging to its last shreds of ideological purpose. The SS units roaming the Tyrolean valleys in the final days of the war were no longer organized divisions acting under a coherent command structure. They were fracturing into packs, bands of die-hard loyalists, stragglers, wounded zealots, and commanders who had lost all sense of the war's strategic reality. For these fanatics, surrender was treason, compassion was weakness, and defeat was worse than death. Their orders, whether real or self-imagined, still echoed with the fury of a dying Reich: prevent Allied advances, punish deserters, crush resistance, annihilate prisoners. As Germany's military infrastructure disintegrated around them, these SS remnants were driven by pure ideological rage, uncontrolled violence, and the belief that one final act of brutality might redeem years of collapse in the eyes of a Führer who no longer held command over anything but a bunker of ghosts. It was into this maelstrom that Castle Itter, isolated, elevated, and filled with high-value prisoners, became a target of deadly opportunity. Word spread quickly among local resistance members and Wehrmacht defectors that a sizable SS contingent had begun moving north from Kufstein. Reports indicated that these were not regular troops conducting a structured retreat, but rather a mix of Waffen-SS soldiers, SS Totenkopf personnel, and rogue elements from various shattered divisions. They were armed, disorganized, and furious, lashing out at civilians, executing deserters, and raiding villages for supplies. Their behavior followed a grim pattern that had become all too familiar in the dying days of the Reich. Before surrendering territory, they cleansed it with fire and blood. Rumors circulated that these SS units had already massacred civilians in nearby hamlets for collaboration, shot wounded Wehrmacht soldiers attempting to flee, and hung German officers suspected of negotiating with the Allies. In this savage landscape, the presence of French VIP prisoners inside Castle Itter was like a beacon, a final chance for the SS to spill high-value blood and deny the Allies a propaganda victory. From their vantage point inside the castle walls, the French prisoners sensed danger before they saw it. They watched smoke rising from villages to the south. They heard bursts of machine gun fire echoing from deep within the forests. They saw movement on the valley roads, black uniformed figures slipping in and out of the tree line with purpose. They understood these signs immediately. For years they had been surrounded by Nazi guards. They knew the rhythms of German military behavior. And the sudden absence of order, no salutes, no patrols, no shouted commands, made the threat feel even more sinister. What frightened them was not discipline, but the lack of it. Controlled SS troops followed protocol. Uncontrolled SS troops followed bloodlust. Inside the fortress, tension mounted rapidly. The imprisoned French political leaders, who normally debated, discussed, and argued like intellectuals even during captivity, now found themselves forced into action. They barricaded gates, reinforced doors with furniture, and organized crude watches along the battlements.
The castle possessed a few rifles left behind by fleeing guards, but they were old, unreliable, and insufficient to mount a real defense. Ammunition was scarce. Food supplies were dwindling. Their only advantage was the thick stone walls of the medieval fortress and the elevated position it occupied. But walls alone could not hold against determined assault. They knew that if the SS surrounded the castle, they would not attempt negotiation or issue demands. They would execute first and search later. Beyond the castle, as Lee and Gang's coalition prepared to march, intelligence reports painted a bleak picture. Scouts observed large groups of SS troops gathering in the woods south of Itter. Smoke trails suggested preparations for a concentration of force, perhaps an assault unit, perhaps a burning line of villages, perhaps the chaotic preparation of a last stand. Gang's contacts in Wurgel intercepted messages hinting at a plan to secure the French prisoners before the Allies reached Tyrol. The meaning was obvious: kill them. Every hour that passed tightened the noose. Every delay risked turning a rescue mission into a recovery mission. The American tankers understood the urgency. They knew SS units, even in disarray, were dangerous. Fanatical troops did not retreat. They made their last stand on whichever ground they could find, and in the chaos of late April 1945, they had little left to lose. For Lee, the mission became a race, not just to reach the castle, but to outrun the SS battalions closing in from the south. His men performed rapid checks of their weapons, oiling machine guns, loading ammunition belts, and inspecting the Sherman tank Beston Jenny that would be the spearhead of their advance. The tank crew, Klein, O'Neill, Dwight, and the others, understood that if the SS reached the castle before they did, the prisoners would likely be dead long before the Americans could climb the mountain road. Major Gang felt the same urgency, but with an even heavier burden. The SS were not merely enemies, they were hunters seeking to punish Wehrmacht officers who had defected. If Gang and his men were captured, their execution would be immediate. No trial, no negotiation, no mercy. And yet Gang felt a strange sense of clarity, perhaps the clearest he had felt in years. His entire career lived under orders he had slowly come to view as poisonous, now distilled into one final purpose: protect the civilians of Tyrol and prevent the SS from completing one last atrocity. For him, marching alongside Americans was not treason, it was redemption. As the coalition forces prepared to depart Wurgel, Austrian resistance members provided critical intelligence. They reported that SS elements had sent scouts toward Itter, likely to determine the castle's defenses. The scouts were seen moving through forests, taking notes on elevations, and marking possible assault routes. Their presence confirmed the worst. An attack had already been planned. The French prisoners would not have days or even hours. They might have only minutes once the SS decided to strike. Meanwhile, inside Castle Itter, the prisoners debated their options with increasing urgency. Some demanded escape attempts, others insisted they fortify the castle, and still others argued that staying inside was suicide. The debate grew heated. Men who had fought political battles in France now fought over planks of wood and rifle barrels. Jean Boratras, restless and alert as ever, attempted to calm the tension by volunteering to leave the castle secretly to find help. But the risk was immense. The path through the forest was crawling with SS patrols, and the valley floor was no safer. If Boratras was captured, the prisoners would lose their only physically capable volunteer. But if no one left the castle, they risked being slaughtered without the Americans ever knowing they were under attack. The threat of SS assault grew more palpable with each passing hour. Through slits in the castle walls, French prisoners observed figures in black uniforms moving closer. The reports from villagers only confirmed what they feared. The SS was massing for a coordinated offensive. Their goal was simple: reach the castle before morning, breach the walls, execute the prisoners, and retreat into the Alps, before American armor could stop them. As every second slipped away, the coalition pressed forward. American tank treads churned through the alpine dirt. Wehrmacht defectors scouted ahead, navigating between SS patrols. Resistance fighters guided the group through back routes and forest paths to avoid ambush. The sense of urgency grew sharper with each mile, the mission taking on a surreal tension. The Americans were racing toward a castle to defend French prisoners they had never met, guided by Wehrmacht soldiers they had been fighting for years, all to stop SS troops who were supposed to be their mutual enemy, but were now the one force intent on killing everyone in their way. The march was not smooth. SS patrols spotted movement and exchanged gunfire with the coalition more than once. At one point, the Americans had to halt and suppress a sniper team hidden along the ridge. Artillery echoes rolled through the valley as distant units fought their own battles. Smoke drifted through the air. Villagers huddled indoors, listening to the distant rumble of the Sherman tank and praying it belonged to liberators rather than executioners. As night crept across the Alps, the coalition finally reached the foothills below Castle Itter. The castle loomed above them, its silhouette sharp against the evening sky, a medieval sentinel ready to witness a battle it had never been designed to withstand. Automatic weapons fire, grenades, rifle volleys, and the clash of 20th-century warfare. From below, the castle seemed quiet, too quiet. No lanterns, no voices, no signs of life. The Americans stared up with unease.
In the silence, the entire valley felt like a trap waiting to snap shut. But the silence was not emptiness. It was the breath held before a storm. Because the SS were not far. They were already moving into position. Hundreds of meters away, deep in the forest, squads of armed men gathered, loading machine guns, preparing grenades, and whispering their orders. They did not intend to take the castle. They intended to erase it. And the coalition racing to save the French prisoners realized, with sudden clarity, they were almost out of time. The enemy was already here. The battle was coming. The road that wound up toward Castle Itter was little more than a narrow alpine ribbon carved into a steep mountainside. An unforgiving ascent of dirt, gravel, and loose stone, bordered on one side by jagged rock walls and on the other by deadly drops into densely forested ravines. It was the kind of path that had challenged horses and medieval carts centuries earlier, never intended to bear the weight of modern armor. Yet now it would decide the fate of VIP prisoners, American tankers, defected Wehrmacht soldiers, and the ragged remnants of the SS, converging on a single point of stone and history. As Lieutenant Jack Lee's Sherman tank Besotten Jenny lurched onto the climbing path, its engine growled under the strain, treads grinding into the terrain with a metallic hunger that echoed through the valley. Behind the tank marched the coalition, German Wehrmacht loyalists to Major Joseph Gangl, American infantrymen carrying M1 Garands and BARs, Austrian resistance fighters with captured Mausers and hunting rifles. Each man knew that the climb would be slow, vulnerable, and fraught with danger. If the SS ambushed them on the road, the coalition would be trapped, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat, unable to spread into defensive positions. But there was no alternative. The castle lay above them, isolated and defenseless, and the SS were closing in from multiple directions. Every second spent navigating the ascent was another second the French prisoners might not have. The air felt unnaturally still as the strange coalition began its upward march. The forests on either side of the road were thick, dark, and silent, the kind of silence that did not reassure but suffocated. Birds did not sing, branches did not sway, even the wind seemed too cautious to whisper. The only sounds were the rhythmic clatter of tank treads, the scratch of boots on gravel, the labored breaths of marching men, and the occasional muted click of safety levers being adjusted or slings being tightened. The Americans scanned the tree line with professional vigilance, rifles angled upward, fingers hovering near triggers. The Wehrmacht defectors held their weapons with tense familiarity, knowing all too well what the SS was capable of. Austrian partisans moved like men born of the mountains, eyes sharp, ears attuned to the slightest disturbance. All of them shared the same thought, the same fear. An ambush here would be devastating. Halfway up the ascent, the feeling of unease shifted into certainty. A faint but unmistakable metallic rattle sounded from the tree line to the left, a sound too deliberate, too controlled to belong to nature. Gangel lifted a clenched fist and the entire column halted instantly. The tank's engine idled with a low rumble as silence swallowed the road. Men froze, listening, waiting. The forest remained still, but this time the stillness was different. It was predatory. And then, with the inevitability of an avalanche breaking loose, the first burst of gunfire shattered the air. A machine gun opened from the slope above, spraying rounds into the road in a vicious downward arc. The bullet struck the rock wall, sending shards of stone exploding outward. Men dove for cover. The Americans returned fire immediately, their Garands barking upward. The tank turret rotated, its 75mm cannon searching for a target, but the angle was too steep for a clean shot. SS soldiers emerged from the tree line, dark figures moving with coordinated aggression, firing from concealed positions. They had anticipated the coalition's approach. Their plan was clear: pin the Americans and Germans on the narrow road, trap them between gunfire and the sheer cliff edge, then annihilate them before they could reach the castle. For the next several minutes, the mountain road became a battleground. Bullets ricocheted off of armor, tree bark exploded in splinters. Men hugged the ground, returning fire in disciplined volleys. Gangel shouted orders in German, directing his defectors to flank the SS positions. A small group of Wehrmacht soldiers scrambled up a secondary footpath, disappearing into the trees like ghosts. Their movement was risky. One misstep and they would tumble into the ravine. But the alternative was certain death. The Americans provided suppressive fire, buying the Germans precious seconds. Meanwhile, the tank crew coordinated silently, each man focused on spotting muzzle flashes. Finally, a bright burst of light from the tree line gave the gunner his mark. He shouted, "Got him!" and the 75mm cannon fired. The explosion tore through the forest, blowing apart the concealed machine gun nest. Trees swayed violently, leaves swirling in the blast wave. Several SS soldiers were thrown back, their bodies tumbling down the slope. Those still alive attempted to reposition, but at that moment Gangel's flanking group struck. From above, German defectors fired downward, catching the SS in a deadly crossfire. The Americans below advanced in short rushes, closing the distance with aggressive precision learned in months of brutal fighting across Europe. The firefight lasted only minutes, but the intensity made it feel like an hour. When the final SS soldier fell, silence returned, not the eerie silence from before, but a heavy, exhausted quiet broken only by the crackle of settling branches and the clink of spent casings rolling on stone. Lee scanned the slope with narrowed eyes, checking for movement. The dead SS soldiers wore mixed uniforms, some Waffen-SS, some Totenkopf, further proof of the chaos gripping the region. Their weapons lay scattered: MP-40 submachine guns, Kar-98K rifles and grenades. The coalition retrieved ammunition and supplies with clinical efficiency. The Americans grabbed extra magazines. The Wehrmacht defectors checked bodies for insignias, hoping to identify which SS detachments were operating nearby. The resistance fighters searched for maps or orders. Nothing concrete turned up, but the ambush alone confirmed that the SS knew the castle was a target and that more enemies awaited ahead. With the danger momentarily cleared, the coalition resumed its ascent. The tank moved forward cautiously, turrets swiveling left and right. The infantry followed closely behind, deeper in thought now than before. The ambush had been a warning, but also a message that the SS were willing to risk manpower to stop them. That meant the castle was likely already surrounded, or would be soon. As they climbed higher, the terrain grew steeper and the air thinner. The forest thinned, revealing steep cliffs and panoramic views of the valley below. The road narrowed again near a sharp bend, forcing the tank to inch forward with agonizing slowness. One wrong movement, and besotted Jenny could slip sideways and plummet into the ravine. Men walked backward, eyes on the tree line. Others scanned ahead with binoculars. The tension felt like a physical weight pressing down on every shoulder. And then,
Just as the castle's gray stone walls came into view at the crest of the hill, the coalition encountered a scene that made every man quicken his pace. The main gate of Castle Itter stood half open, held shut only by a makeshift barricade of planks, overturned furniture, and broken carts. A French prisoner, one of the dignitaries, stood on top of the battlement waving urgently at the approaching coalition. His gestures were frantic, not celebratory. He pointed repeatedly toward the southern slope of the mountain where dark movement shifted between the treetops. A warning. Lee understood instantly. He said, "The SS are already here." Before the coalition could react, rifle fire cracked from the forest to the south. Bullets struck the castle walls, sending shards of ancient stone flying outward. French prisoners scrambled for cover. Someone shouted, "Ils arrivent! They are coming!" More rifle fire followed. The assault had begun. Lee ordered the tank into position. The Sherman rumbled forward, stopping directly in front of the castle gate, its steel body forming an improvised shield. American infantry spread out, taking defensive positions around the tank. Gangel's Wehrmacht defectors moved to secure the flanks. Austrian partisans sprinted to the castle courtyard, shouting instructions to the prisoners inside. Chaos erupted instantly, but controlled chaos, the kind that accompanies veterans who have been in battle long enough to recognize how quickly the first seconds decide everything. French prisoners rushed to help lift the barricade, allowing the coalition fighters to enter the courtyard. Inside, the scene was surreal. Political leaders, generals, and ministers clutching rifles, pistols, or even wooden clubs as they ran to reinforce the battlements. They had not waited passively. They had prepared. Makeshift firing positions dotted the courtyard. The old castle arrow slits had been cleared for rifle fire. Sandbags and crates had been arranged into defensive parapets. For a moment, Lee was struck by the absurdity of it all. Men who had once commanded nations, now taking orders from an American lieutenant and a German officer fighting side by side. But there was no time for reflection. From beyond the forest tree line came the chilling sounds of SS whistles and shouted commands. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of enemy soldiers were preparing to storm the castle. The coalition had arrived just in time. The French prisoners closed the gates behind them. The Sherman tank pointed its cannon toward the forest. Rifle bolts clicked. Machine guns were mounted. Men took positions along the walls. The battle for Castle Itter, the strangest alliance battle of World War II, was about to begin.
The first bullets that struck the ancient walls of Castle Itter carried with them not just the metallic crack of gunfire, but the unmistakable message that the battle had begun in full force. A message written in the violent percussion of rifles, the whistling hiss of incoming rounds, and the sudden eruption of splintered stone that rained down from the battlements. As the SS opened fire from the tree line and began to fan out across the lower slope, the strange alliance inside the castle snapped immediately into coordinated action. Lieutenant Jack Lee, positioned near his Sherman tank, shouted commands over the noise, his voice sharp and confident. Major Gangel translated the critical orders for his Wehrmacht defectors, who took positions along the lower walls with practiced efficiency. The Austrian resistance fighters, who knew the terrain better than any man present, dashed to vantage points that gave overlapping fields of fire. But the French prisoners, politicians, generals, intellectuals, and former national leaders, stood out most in that chaotic moment. Stripped of influence for years, they now stood shoulder to shoulder with rifle-bearing soldiers, clutching whatever weapons they had been able to gather. Mausers left behind by fleeing guards, pistols smuggled into the castle months earlier, and in some cases, sharpened tools or wooden poles gripped with trembling determination. The surreal unity of this group, American, German, Austrian, and French, formed an unbreakable line just as the SS prepared to test its strength. From the southern slope, the SS emerged in coordinated bursts, moving through the shadows of the evergreen forest in a staggered formation that revealed their experience in mountain warfare. These were not green troops. Even fractured and leaderless as they were, they belonged to units forged in brutality, trained to strike with precision and without mercy. Their black uniforms blended with the dark of the forest, their helmets reflecting the faintest glimmer of dawn.
At first, they tested the defenses, firing sporadic volleys to probe the castle's response. Bullets cracked against the battlements, sending French prisoners diving behind stone parapets. One round shattered the edge of an arrow loop just inches above Daladier's head, showering him with dust and stone fragments. Another struck the metal handle of a wooden boar, sending sparks flying. But the defenders did not return fire immediately. Lee wanted the SS to reveal their positions fully before the battle escalated. When the SS began to move in larger numbers, spreading across the hillside, taking up positions behind fallen logs and outcroppings, assembling a base of fire, Lee gave the order, "Open fire." The castle erupted. American rifles barked from the battlements. Wehrmacht defectors unleashed disciplined volleys with their Kar 98Ks. The resistance fighters fired down the slope from concealed ledges, picking off SS soldiers attempting to advance. The Sherman tank thundered with the roar of its .5 caliber machine gun, the heavy rounds tearing into trees and sending wood fragments exploding like shrapnel. Tracers streaked through the air in bright arcs. The castle courtyard filled with the deafening reverberations of gunfire, bouncing between stone walls and amplifying every shot into a roaring storm. The SS attempted to return fire, but the castle's elevation gave the defenders a clear advantage. Many of their rounds struck the lower walls harmlessly, others embedded themselves uselessly in thick stone. But the attackers were relentless. More soldiers emerged from the tree line, spreading out to encircle the castle. A group broke left, attempting to flank the fortress from the northeast. Another group moved right, angling down into a ravine where they could potentially approach the castle's unguarded rear slope. The defenders quickly recognized the danger. Major Gangel sent a squad of Wehrmacht defectors to reinforce the northwest corner, where the wall sloped downward toward the forest. The French prisoners, seeing the shift, followed with determination. Gamelin, Renault, and Boratras moving with surprising urgency, even as bullets cracked overhead. Meanwhile, Lee kept his attention fixed on the southern approach, where the densest concentration of SS soldiers appeared to be gathering. Through binoculars, he spotted the distinctive outline of an MG-42 being set up behind a rocky outcrop. The German machine gun, infamous for its devastating rate of fire, could tear apart the battlements if allowed to operate freely. Without hesitation, Lee slapped the turret of his Sherman tank, signaling the gunner to target the position. The cannon fired, the blast echoing through the valley with a concussive boom. The shell struck the outcrop, sending a volcanic spray of stone shards in every direction and silencing the MG-42 just as its barrel began to rise. But the destruction of one machine gun nest did little to slow the enemy. More SS troops advanced from the tree line, some firing as they ran, others diving behind cover to return fire. Grenades began to arc upward from below, exploding against the outer walls and shaking the castle's foundations. The defenders felt the tremors in their bones. Dust trickled from ancient mortar joints. Wooden beams rattled in the ceilings of the lower halls. The French prisoners, many of whom had never fired a weapon in battle, found themselves locked in a deadly exchange of gunfire, their political rivalries forgotten in the face of a common enemy. Mary Agnes Callot, de Gaulle's sister, moved between defensive positions with remarkable composure, helping distribute ammunition and keeping the older prisoners calm. John Boratras, restless and fearless, shifted from one battlement to another, calling out enemy movements in French and German. At one point, he grabbed a dropped rifle and began firing down into the ravine where a squad of SS soldiers attempted to advance the slope. His shots were accurate, his stance steady, years of athletic discipline translating seamlessly into battlefield focus. The SS soon adjusted their tactics. Realizing that head-on assault would be costly, they attempted to concentrate on suppressive fire, pinning down defenders while infiltration squads crept toward the castle's lower perimeter. A group of 15 SS troops made a daring charge up the eastern slope, using the natural folds of the terrain as cover. They advanced rapidly, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, and shouting commands that echoed through the forest. For a moment, it seemed they might reach the base of the walls. But the defenders held. From the highest tower, an American bar gunner unleashed a stream of suppressive fire, forcing the SS to dive behind rocks. Austrian resistance fighters positioned themselves along a narrow ledge and fired into the advancing squad with deadly precision. Gangel himself took up a rifle and shot 2 SS soldiers attempting to dash across open ground. His shots were accurate, his stance steady, years of athletic discipline translating seamlessly into battlefield focus. The SS soon adjusted their tactics. Realizing that head-on assault would be costly, they attempted to concentrate on suppressive fire, pinning down defenders while infiltration squads crept toward the castle's lower perimeter. A group of 15 SS troops made a daring charge up the eastern slope using the natural folds of the terrain as cover. They advanced rapidly, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, and shouting commands that echoed through the forest. For a moment, it seemed they might reach the base of the walls. But the defenders held. From the highest tower, an American bar gunner unleashed a stream of suppressive fire, forcing the SS to dive behind rocks. Austrian resistance fighters positioned themselves along a narrow ledge and fired into the advancing squad with deadly precision. Gangel himself took up a rifle and shot 2 SS soldiers attempting to dash across open ground. His shots were accurate, his stance steady, years of athletic discipline translating seamlessly into battlefield focus. The Sooners adjusted their tactics. Realizing that head-on assault would be costly, they attempted to concentrate on suppressive fire, pinning down defenders while infiltration squads crept toward the castle's lower perimeter. A group of 15 SS troops made a daring charge up the eastern slope using the natural folds of the terrain as cover. They advanced rapidly, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, and shouting commands that echoed through the forest. For a moment, it seemed they might reach the base of the walls. But the defenders held. From the highest tower, an American bar gunner unleashed a stream of suppressive fire, forcing the SS to dive behind rocks. Austrian resistance fighters positioned themselves along a narrow ledge and fired into the advancing squad with deadly precision. Gangel himself took up a rifle and shot 2 SS soldiers attempting to dash across open ground. His shots were accurate, his stance steady, years of athletic discipline translating seamlessly into battlefield focus. The SS soon adjusted their tactics. Realizing that head-on assault would be costly, they attempted to concentrate on suppressive fire, pinning down defenders while infiltration squads crept toward the castle's lower perimeter. A group of 15 SS troops made a daring charge up the eastern slope using the natural folds of the terrain as cover. They advanced rapidly, firing from the hip, throwing grenades, and shouting commands that echoed through the forest. For a moment, it seemed they might reach the base of the walls. But the defenders held. From the highest tower, an American bar gunner unleashed a stream of suppressive fire, forcing the SS to dive behind rocks. Austrian resistance fighters positioned themselves along a narrow ledge and fired into the advancing squad with deadly precision. Gangel himself took up a rifle and shot 2 SS soldiers attempting to dash across open ground. The French prisoners, emboldened by the determination of their allies, added their own fire, uncertain but fearless. The attack faltered. The SS fallback was chaotic, some sliding down the slope, others retreating deeper into the forest. The first wave had been repelled, but the defenders knew this was only the beginning. The SS were testing their defenses, probing for weaknesses. More troops were likely on the way. Through binoculars, Lee spotted movement farther south, larger formations of black uniformed
figures marching with purpose toward the castle. The sheer number of them made his stomach tighten. They were not facing a small detachment. This was a full assault force, one that could easily number in the hundreds once fully in position. Inside the castle, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were surrounded. No reinforcements were guaranteed. Their ammunition was limited. The only armored vehicle they had was the Sherman tank, and its fuel was low after days of rapid movement. The radio was their lifeline, but static crackled through it with increasing intensity, threatening to cut them off from the outside world. Yet, despite everything, morale inside the castle remained strong. The defenders felt the strange electricity that comes from fighting a battle that defies every logic of war. American and German soldiers shared magazines. French prisoners passed ammunition to Austrian partisans. Orders were shouted in English, German, and French, overlapping into a chaotic but functional multilingual command structure. For a moment, national boundaries and political histories vanished into the smoke-filled air of a shared battlefield. Another volley of gunfire erupted from the forest, snapping everyone back to the present. The SS were regrouping, they were repositioning, and the defenders could see them clearly now, moving with grim determination, carrying more weapons, preparing more machine gun nests. The battle was escalating. The SS were gathering for a second assault, and the defenders of Castle Itter braced themselves for the onslaught. The first shots had been fired. The real fight was only beginning. The defenders of Castle Itter had barely repelled the first wave when the true scale of their predicament revealed itself, not in the echo of gunfire or the screams of the wounded, but in the grim silence that followed. It was the silence of an enemy regrouping, of dark shapes shifting in the forests as SS commanders barked orders, positioning their men for a more coordinated assault. For a brief moment, the castle stood suspended in a tense stillness, like the breath drawn before a thunderclap. The defenders, scattered across the battlements, wiped dust from their faces and quickly reloaded, hands trembling not with fear but with urgency. Lieutenant Jack Lee stood by his Sherman tank, jaw set in a hardened line. Major Joseph Gangle scanned the tree line with a soldier's practiced eye, noting the patterns of enemy movement. The French prisoners, men who had once commanded nations but now clutched rifles with shaking hands, realized that they were no longer passive captives, but soldiers in the most improbable battle of the war. All of them understood the same truth. When the next attack came, it would strike harder than before. The castle, with its ancient stone walls and narrow defensive slits, provided a natural fortress, but it was also a trap. There was no room to maneuver, no escape route except the steep cliffside, no reinforcements beyond the improbable coalition that had managed to reach them. Ammunition was limited. Every shot needed to count. The Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, though formidable, had only so many rounds left for its cannon and machine guns. And as the defenders looked out over the forested slopes below, they realized with mounting dread that the SS force gathering there was larger than they had anticipated. Dark forms moved in coordinated lines, rifle barrels glinted in the weak morning light. Command whistles pierced the air. The enemy had not retreated. They were preparing for a full, all-out assault. Then it began. The first sign was a series of sharp cracks from the south, followed by the unmistakable roar of multiple MG-42 machine guns firing in synchronized bursts. The air filled with the high-pitched, tearing sound of the Hitler's buzzsaw, its bullets shredding the stone edges of the battlements. Chips of masonry flew in every direction. French prisoners ducked behind whatever cover they could find as bullets ripped through the air above their heads. The defenders returned fire almost immediately. American infantrymen fired controlled volleys toward muzzle flashes in the tree line. Austrian resistance fighters, familiar with the terrain's hidden folds, aimed for silhouettes darting between rocks. Wehrmacht defectors added their precision fire, using their knowledge of German tactics to predict where the SS would move next. But the SS were relentless. Under covering fire from their machine guns, a large group advanced quickly up the slope, using depressions in the ground and fallen logs as cover. Their movements were disciplined, their formation tight. These men were not broken stragglers, they were trained killers making a final stand. Every few seconds, one of them popped up to fire, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. Grenades exploded against the castle walls, sending vibrations through the structure. The French prisoners tightened their grips on their weapons, sweat dripping down their faces as they prepared to fire on exposed targets. From the highest tower, Jack Lee's BAR team unleashed deep, chattering bursts that cut down several advancing SS troops. But the attackers quickly replaced their fallen comrades. They were pushing forward inexorably, climbing over rocks and roots with terrifying determination. Lee recognized the pattern. This was the beginning of a large-scale assault. The SS intended to reach the lower walls and plant explosives or force entry at weak points. If they succeeded, the castle would fall. Lee slammed his fist against the turret of the Sherman. "Jenny, we need fire on the left flank," he shouted. The tank roared to life, its machine guns spraying the hillside with suppressive fire. The cannon spoke moments later, firing an armor-piercing round that tore into a cluster of trees and sent SS soldiers scattering. The explosion rocked the valley, lighting up the foliage and briefly slowing the enemy momentum. But the tank drew immediate retaliation. Multiple Panzerfausts, German anti-tank weapons, fired from different angles, streaking up the slope with trails of smoke.
One shot hit the stone just below the tank, sending a violent shockwave through the courtyard. The Sherman lurched but held steady. Another round grazed its turret, leaving a scorch mark. The tank crew worked with desperate speed to identify the Panzerfaust teams before they could reload. The Americans fired at their general direction, but the SS were well hidden in the undergrowth. Meanwhile, on the eastern side of the castle, a second SS group began scaling the lower slope, using ropes and natural footholds to approach the walls. They had identified a blind spot in the defenders' coverage and were exploiting it with precision. If they reached the base of the wall, they could plant explosives or attempt to breach through the old drainage tunnel. Gengel saw them first and shouted for reinforcements. A squad of Wehrmacht defectors sprinted across the courtyard, bullets flying around them as they moved to block the attempt. One of the defectors, a young corporal with mud-streaked boots, leaned out over the parapet and fired repeatedly, driving the SS climbers back. But the defectors could not hold that position alone. The SS were too numerous, too coordinated. Another group of defenders, this time a mixture of French prisoners and Austrian partisans, rushed to the tower's edge to join the firefight. Jean Boutre positioned himself bravely near the parapet, firing downward with controlled accuracy. Paul Reynaud, despite his age, knelt behind a stone block and provided covering fire with a pistol. General Gamelin, once a chief of staff in the French military, called out enemy movements with the sharp clarity of an experienced officer, guiding defenders where to concentrate their fire. Below them, the SS continued their climb. And then, with sudden violence, the eastern slope erupted into chaos. A grenade thrown by an SS climber detonated just below the parapet, sending a concussion blast that knocked several defenders off their feet. One Wehrmacht defector was thrown backward, blood pooling beneath him as the others struggled to regain their positions. Gengel himself helped pull the dazed soldier into cover while shouting instructions in rapid German. At the same time, rifle fire intensified along the southern wall. The SS were attempting a simultaneous assault on multiple fronts, stretching the defenders thin. Bullets hammered the battlements. Several rounds pierced windows and shattered ancient glass. The defenders felt the pressure mounting with every second. They could not be everywhere at once. Lee realized they needed to hold the line long enough for the Americans to send reinforcements. He rushed to the radio operator, who was crouched behind a thick stone column, fiddling with the equipment as static hissed through the headphones. "Can you reach anyone?" Lee demanded. "Trying, sir," he muttered, adjusting dials with shaking hands. "Signal's weak. Interference from the mountains." "Keep trying," Lee said tersely, before returning to the front lines. As the battle raged, ammunition began to run low. The defenders passed magazines for one another, sharing bullets like lifelines. French prisoners tore fabric from old furniture to use as bandages. Austrian partisans retrieved spent enemy grenades and hurled them back when possible. Every man understood that conserving resources was essential. They had no supply chain, no reinforcements, no fallback plan. Suddenly, the SS shifted tactics again. From the forest emerged a group carrying a portable shield constructed from metal sheets, and an improvised but effective device that allowed them to approach the walls behind mobile cover. They advanced slowly, firing around the edges of the shield. This was a method used in urban fighting, and it was brutally effective. Lee saw the danger immediately. If the SS reached the base of the wall with that shield, they could set charges and blow a hole in the castle's defenses. "Target that shield," he shouted. American riflemen concentrated fire, but the shield absorbed the hits. The Austrian partisans fired into the legs of the attackers, dropping 2 of them. But more SS soldiers rushed forward, grabbing the shield and continuing the advance. Lee knew only one thing could stop them: the tank. He climbed onto the Sherman and told the gunner to line up a point-blank shot on the shield. The crew hesitated. The angle was awkward. The risk of damaging the castle wall was high, but Lee insisted. The cannon fired. The blast obliterated the shield, sending twisted metal flying in all directions. The SS soldiers behind it were thrown violently backward, their attack shattered. The defenders cheered, but the victory was brief. Another SS squad had already begun a similar approach on the western slope. The battle had become a continuous cycle of crisis and improvisation. Every moment demanded new decisions, new risks, new sacrifices. Smoke hung thick in the air. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the musk of sweat and fear. The castle's stones grew warm from the constant barrage of bullets and explosions, but the defenders held. Hour after hour, they repelled waves of attackers. They fought until their shoulders ached and their ears rang. They fought until their fingers blistered from loading rounds. They fought until the courtyard floor was littered with spent casings and debris. They fought not because victory was certain, but because surrender was not an option. And yet, despite their determination, one truth loomed larger with each passing minute. They could not hold forever. The SS were relentless, they were increasing in number, they were adjusting their tactics, and at some point they would attempt a final, overwhelming assault. Inside Castle Itter, the defenders braced themselves. They had bought time, but time was running out.
The moment the SS committed to their full-scale assault on Castle Itter, the valley seemed to convulse with violence. It was no longer the scattered bursts of probing fire or the tentative attempts to advance along the slope. It was a coordinated, multi-directional offensive born from fanatic desperation and the warped discipline of men who had nothing left to lose. The forest erupted with muzzle flashes as dozens of SS rifles opened fire simultaneously. Their machine guns roared in overlapping waves, stitching bullets into the stone walls, cutting across the battlements, and forcing defenders to duck behind whatever cover they could find. Grenades arced through the air like deadly sparks, exploding against parapets, shattering centuries-old stonework, and sending dust clouds billowing through the courtyard. The medieval fortress, which had weathered wars, sieges, and revolts in its long history, now trembled under the fury of 20th-century firepower. Lieutenant Jack Lee knew immediately that this was not just another wave. This was the decisive push, the moment when the SS intended to break the defenders' will and take the castle, whatever the cost. He sprinted from one defensive position to another, shouting orders over the deafening cacophony. "Hold the high tower! Reinforce the east wall! Conserve ammo!" His voice was hoarse, but his presence had become the unifying force of the defenders. Major Josef Gungel moved with similar urgency, relaying instructions in German, coordinating the Wehrmacht defectors, and directing Austrian partisans who knew the terrain intimately enough to predict exactly where the next SS squads would emerge. The defenders returned fire with everything they had. American riflemen fired disciplined volleys from behind stone merlons. Wehrmacht defectors used their intimate knowledge of German tactics to anticipate enemy routes, firing into the shadows before SS soldiers could even emerge. Austrian resistance fighters unleashed precise bursts from concealed ledges and windows, hitting targets that others could only vaguely see. And the French prisoners, former ministers, generals, statesmen, fired down from the battlements with rifles they barely knew how to operate, their hands shaking, but their determination unbroken. As the SS surged forward, the defenders' disparate backgrounds dissolved into the raw instinct of survival. Then came the first sign of the SS strategy: suppression and saturation. Machine gun nests in the tree line opened up in waves, pushing defenders away from the parapets. SS riflemen moved forward in short, coordinated bursts, taking advantage of every rock, stump, and shadow. Mortar rounds, fired from somewhere deep in the forest, began to fall on the outer walls, sending showers of stone and debris flying through the air. One round struck the southern tower, blowing a chunk of the wall outward and nearly sending a French prisoner tumbling over the edge. The defenders dragged him back just as bullets tore through the space where he had been standing seconds earlier. Below them, the SS assault teams advanced with horrifying determination. Using the mortar fire as cover, squads carrying satchel charges and grenades attempted to reach the base of the walls. Others carried Panzerfausts, hoping to disable the Sherman tank. Their movements were coordinated, their discipline chilling. These were not broken deserters. They were loyalists of a dying ideology determined to spill as much blood as possible before the war ended. The defenders knew the greatest danger came from below. If the SS reached the walls, they could plant explosives, breach the gates, or force open the drainage tunnels. Jack Lee positioned the Sherman tank to cover the most vulnerable approach, the southern slope, where the attackers seemed most concentrated. The tank's machine gun roared to life, mowing down several SS soldiers attempting to sprint across open ground. but the SS quickly adapted, using smoke grenades to obscure their approach. Gray plumes billowed upward, swallowing the slope and turning the battlefield into a fog-shrouded nightmare. Amid the smoke, shapes moved, dark, fleeting, and indistinct. Lee ordered the tank's turret to rotate, firing blind into the densest clusters of movement. The cannon thundered, sending shockwaves through the courtyard, but the smoke worked both ways. Defenders struggled to see the attackers, and the SS used that advantage mercilessly. Gunfire tore through the fog. Grenades detonated against the walls. A bullet grazed Barato's arm, drawing blood but not stopping him. He gritted his teeth, wrapped a strip of cloth around the wound, and returned to his position. Then came the cry from the eastern wall. "They're climbing the ravine!" Gungle rushed to the edge and saw them, SS climbers scaling the steep rocks with ropes and grappling hooks, using the natural terrain to approach the castle's least defended flank. Their movements were swift and calculated. If they reached the top, they would be behind the defenders. Gungle grabbed a rifle and fired, but the climbers kept coming. American and Austrian fighters joined him, firing downward, picking off climber one by one. But for every attacker who fell, another took his place. The SS seemed endless, an inexhaustible tide of black uniforms pushing forward with suicidal determination. On the western side, another crisis unfolded. An SS machine gun team emerged from the fog, dragging an MG-42 and setting it up behind a fallen tree. Their fire tore into the battlements, pinning the defenders and allowing another squad to advance. The defected Wehrmacht corporal spotted them, screamed a warning, but the defenders were already under heavy fire. Gungle realized they needed to neutralize that machine gun immediately, or the castle's western wall would be overwhelmed. He and an American soldier darted across the courtyard, bullets zipping past them, and took cover behind a stone buttress. Together they fired repeatedly at the SS gun team, but their angle was too high to hit effectively. The MG-42 continued its deadly sweep, carving stone fragments off the battlements and forcing French prisoners to retreat deeper into the tower. "We need the tank!" Gungle shouted. Lee swung the Sherman's turret towards the western slope, but the angle was terrible. The tank could not depress its gun enough to hit the machine gun nest. Lee cursed under his breath. They needed a forward observer. Someone who could mark the target clearly. Before anyone could volunteer, Barato stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "You're wounded," Lee snapped. "It's a scratch," Barato replied, already moving. He sprinted across the courtyard with an agility that defied belief for a man who had been prisoned for years. He climbed the stairway to the upper parapet, leapt over a fallen beam, and reached the perfect vantage point. Bullets whipped past him, one striking the stone at his feet. Barato didn't flinch. He grabbed a white cloth, tied it to a broken spear shaft, and signaled to the tank crew, swinging the improvised flag toward the machine gun nest with bold, sweeping motions. Lee understood instantly. The Sherman fired. The shell hit the fallen log and detonated with a violent, explosive burst. The machine gun nest was obliterated. SS bodies tumbled backward. The fire on the western slope faltered. But in achieving this, Barato had exposed himself. A sniper shot cracked from the tree line. Barato spun, staggered, and collapsed behind the parapet. French prisoners rushed to him. The wound was deep, but he was alive. "Get him inside!" Gemmeling shouted. They dragged Barato into the castle, leaving a streak of blood across the stone floor. The defenders' victory was temporary. A horn sounded from the forest, a shrill, eerie call. The SS were signaling the next phase. And then they surged. Hundreds of figures emerged from the smoke-filled tree line, advancing in a line that stretched across the entire southern slope. They were screaming now, feral, furious, unhinged, the sound of an army beyond discipline, beyond reason, beyond humanity. It was a terrifying moment, the kind that froze even the most hardened soldier's blood. The defenders unleashed everything they had. Rifles fired until barrels grew hot. Machine guns rattled until ammo belts ran dry. Grenades were hurled over the parapets. The tank fired shell after shell. Still the SS climbed. Still they advanced. Still they came. The castle walls shook under the barrage. Defenders fell back from the parapets as grenades exploded overhead. Smoke choked the air. The courtyard trembled. The SS had not broken through, but they had reached the walls. The full-scale assault had begun, and the defenders of Castle Itter were running out of strength, ammunition, and time.
The moment the SS reached the lower walls of Castle Itter, the battle transformed from a firefight into a desperate, primal struggle for survival. One fought not with strategic advantage, but with sheer willpower, dwindling ammunition, and the stubborn refusal of the defenders to yield to a force that should have overwhelmed them hours earlier. The castle, a relic of stone and history, groaned under the relentless assault like a living creature wounded by centuries of accumulated violence. Yet its ancient walls still stood, battered but unbroken, just as the strange coalition within them clung stubbornly to life. As the smoke thickened, mixing with dust, sweat, and the acrid sting of gunpowder, the defenders felt the noose tightening. Every battlement, tower, and window had become a last line of defense. Every man, no matter his rank, nationality, or background, now fought with the knowledge that the next minute might be his last. The SS pressed forward with a fanatic determination that bordered on suicidal. They climbed the slopes under withering fire, darted between rocks like predatory shadows, fired rifles and submachine guns with a kind of furious precision born from ideological desperation, and hurled grenades that burst against the castle walls in violent blossoms of smoke and shrapnel. The defenders fired back, but their ammunition was running dangerously low. Rifle clips clattered empty. Machine gun belts dwindled. The Sherman tank's machine gun sputtered after long bursts, its barrel overheating from the sustained fire. The defenders were forced to choose their shots carefully. No more spraying fire, no more wasting bullets. Every trigger pull had to count. Still, the SS climbed. Jack Lee moved constantly, shouting orders, encouraging exhausted defenders, and personally firing his carbine down into the chaos below, his voice hoarse and raw from hours of shouting. He felt the castle itself vibrating under the concussive blasts of grenades and mortar rounds, felt each near miss shake through the stone beneath his boots. He knew they could not hold forever. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outpositioned. But he also knew that every minute they held out increased the chance that American reinforcements, somewhere out there in the Tyrolean valleys, might hear the echoes of battle. Major Joseph Gangel moved with equal urgency, alternating between commanding his Wehrmacht defectors, returning fire with cold precision, and helping wounded defenders back into whatever shelter the castle still offered. At one point, Gangel grabbed a wounded Austrian resistance fighter by the collar and dragged him away from the parapet, just as an SS bullet shattered the stone behind them. "You move only when I tell you to," he shouted, his voice cracking, not with anger, but with the weight of a man who knew that every loss was now irreplaceable. The French prisoners, despite their inexperience with combat, had become indispensable. Edouard Dallier, his face streaked with dust and blood, used a captured rifle with surprising competence, firing at the base of the walls where SS climbers attempted to attach charges. Paul Reynaud, despite his age, crawled along the battlements gathering ammunition from fallen fighters and redistributing it with cold efficiency. Jean Bartreau, wounded but refusing to stay idle, insisted on returning to the walls with a pistol in one hand and a makeshift bandage tied tightly around his arm. The other prisoners had to physically restrain him long enough to administer basic medical aid before he disappeared back into the smoke-filled battlements. Even General Gamelin, whose leadership had once been heavily criticized in France, now stood firm on the ramparts, firing into the advancing SS with the hardened focus of a man determined to redeem something of his past through this final act of defiance. Their efforts helped hold the line, but the SS numbers were overwhelming. Through the smoke, the defenders could see wave after wave emerging from the forest's edge, clusters of black uniforms advancing in staggered formations, flanking maneuvers unfolding with chilling synchrony. The first breach came not through the walls themselves, but through the defenders' collapse of resources. The southwestern parapet fell silent for nearly 10 seconds, a deadly eternity, because its defenders had run out of ammunition. In that moment of silence, the SS surged toward that section, sensing weakness. They bounded across the lower slope, firing wildly, hurling grenades, and shouting commands. Jack saw the opening instantly. "Reinforce the southwest corner," he bellowed, sprinting across the courtyard as bullets snapped around him.
Wehrmacht defectors answered immediately, racing to fill the gap. One German sergeant hurled himself into position without hesitation, firing point-blank into the SS coming through the gap until he took a burst of submachine gun fire to the chest and collapsed, his rifle clattering beside him. Another defector took his place almost immediately, firing downward while blood trickled from a gash on his forehead. But even with reinforcements, the defenders were barely holding on. Then the eastern wall began to crumble. A coordinated series of SS grenades shook the parapet, sending stones tumbling. One explosion blew a gap large enough for 2 men to stand shoulder to shoulder. In the smoking breach, 3 SS soldiers attempted to climb through. They were met with a whirlwind of resistance, Austrian partisans firing pistols at point-blank range, a French prisoner swinging a rifle like a club, and Gangl himself arriving just in time to shoot the third attacker through the chest. But the breach remained. The defenders were forced to create a makeshift barricade out of beams, furniture, and sandbags, all while bullets ripped through the opening and sent splinters flying. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. On the south slope, the SS finally reached the base of the outer wall. Shouts in German echoed upward as attackers planted satchel charges, their movements frantic and hurried as they worked under fire. The defenders saw them immediately and opened fire, but many shots missed or struck stone. The tank crew attempted to depress the main gun enough to fire on the climbers, but the angle was too sharp. The 50 caliber machine gun chattered, cutting down several SS soldiers, but not all. Lee banged his fist against the turret. "We can't let them breach that wall." But as he spoke, the defenders saw the inevitable. The satchel charges were set. A tense silence rippled through the battlefield. Then the explosion erupted like a thunderclap. The lower section of the outer wall buckled, stones collapsing outward in a cascade of rubble and dust. The blast sent several defenders flying backward, their screams drowned in the roar of falling masonry. Dust swallowed the courtyard, smoke billowed upward. For a moment, visibility was nearly zero. Shapes moved in the haze, friend and foe indistinguishable as the defenders coughed, blinked, and braced for the next assault. It came 1 second later. SS soldiers surged toward the breach, dozens of them firing wildly as they climbed over the rubble. The defenders scrambled to meet them. Lee, Gangl, and a group of American infantrymen mounted a desperate countercharge, firing down into the breach with everything they had left. Pistols cracked, carbines barked. A Wehrmacht defector leapt onto the rubble pile, shouting, "Halt! Halt!" before being shot twice and tumbling backward. Austrian partisans hurled grenades over the broken wall, slowing the attackers but failing to stop them entirely. At one point, an SS soldier breached the courtyard itself, charging forward with a knife in his hand, face twisted with fanatical rage. Before he could strike, Marie-Agnes Calliot, de Gaulle's sister, grabbed a fallen rifle and struck him across the head with the buttstock, dropping him instantly. She stood trembling for a moment, then lifted the weapon again, ready for the next attacker. The defenders around her found strength in her courage, but courage alone could not replenish bullets or rebuild walls. Every minute that passed drained the defenders further. Ammunition was nearly gone. The tank had only a few shells left. Several machine guns sat silent, their belts spent. Men were bleeding, exhausted, and dangerously close to collapse. Gangl knew they could not survive another full-scale assault. Lee knew it too. The French prisoners whispered among themselves, asking whether reinforcements would come or whether they were already doomed. And then came the most terrifying sound of the entire siege. A horn blast from the forest. Not the sharp signal of squad movement, not the whistle of a coordinated maneuver. A long, unified horn blast. A signal for the final SS assault. The defenders braced themselves, every muscle tense, every heart pounding. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Their walls were breached. Their ammunition was nearly gone. Their allies lay wounded or dead. Yet they stood, weapons shaking in bruised hands, ready to fight until they could no longer stand. Because this was the last stand of Castle Itter. And they knew that if they fell, the SS would kill every last one of them.
The final horn blast from the forest rolled across the valley like a death knell, reverberating through the stone bones of Castle Itter and sinking into the hearts of every defender perched along its battered walls. It was a sound that carried with it the full weight of everything the SS intended.
No more probing attacks. No more cautious advances. No more methodical pressure. This was the call to annihilation. The defenders didn't need translation. They didn't need to understand the ideological madness behind it. They simply knew that the next minutes would decide whether they lived or died. And as the echo faded into the smoke-filled air, the forest erupted with movement. Hundreds, yes, hundreds of SS troops surged from the tree line in a wave of black uniforms, helmets glinting beneath the weak sunlight, weapons raised, boots pounding the earth with the thunderous rhythm of fanatic rage. It was a sight that froze the blood of even the most battle-hardened defenders. The SS were no longer advancing cautiously. They were charging, screaming battle cries that ricocheted off the mountains like the wails of the damned. Rifle fire exploded in deafening unison, bullets snapping overhead and striking the castle walls with vicious intensity. The ground shook from grenades, smoke billowed, the air filled with the acrid stink of cordite. And for the defenders inside Castle Itter, this was the moment everything threatened to collapse. Jack Lee felt it instantly. There was a moment, a single terrible heartbeat, when he saw the enemy moving like a dark river and realized the castle's defenses could not withstand a full frontal assault of this magnitude. Their ammunition was dwindling into nothing. Half the defenders were wounded. The battlements were crumbling, the walls had multiple breaches, and the Sherman tank, besotted Jenny, once their most powerful asset, now sat low in the courtyard, with smoke curling from its engine vents, its machine gun nearly empty, its cannon down to its last few shells. The tank crew had held back the SS for hours, but the strain of constant fire had worn down both the tank and the men inside it. When the final assault began, Lee shouted to the gunner to fire one more shell into the forest, hoping to break the initial charge. The cannon barked one last thunderous blast, sending a shell screaming into the densest cluster of advancing troops, blowing bodies into the air, but the recoil jolted the tank violently, and something inside broke. A loud metallic crack echoed from within the Sherman. Smoke gushed from the rear. The engine sputtered. Sparks flew. "She's done!" the driver cried. "We're dead in the water!" Lee felt the bottom drop out of his chest. Without the tank, they lost their heaviest fire support. But there was no time to mourn the machine. The SS charge was already reaching the lower walls. Gunfire intensified. The battlements trembled as bullets hit in continuous sheets. The defenders opened fire with everything they had left. American riflemen fired until their clips were empty, then scavenged fallen weapons. Wehrmacht defectors, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, fired down into the swarm of attackers while shouting warnings to one another in frantic German. Austrian partisans hurled their last grenades over the parapets, explosions ripping through the front ranks of the SS. French prisoners, once leaders of a nation, gritted their teeth and pulled their triggers with shaking hands. Bourtreau, wounded but unyielding, leaned against the wall to steady himself as he fired a pistol into the mass below. General Gamelin directed men with the steady calm of someone who had finally found redemption. Even Renault shouted encouragement, urging the defenders to hold their ground, to stand firm for just a few more minutes. But the SS came on with terrifying momentum. They reached the breached southern wall in a flood of bodies, climbing over rubble, firing into the courtyard, screaming as they advanced. The defenders focused fire on the breach, dropping men in rapid succession, but the wave was too large. For every attacker that fell, 2 more appeared. The breach widened as more stones crumbled under the strain of explosions. The defenders had barricaded it with beams and crates, but the hastily built obstruction trembled as the SS pressed into it, shoving, climbing, tearing at the wood with bare hands in their frenzy to break through. On the eastern wall, the situation was just as dire. The earlier breach, where SS climbers had nearly stormed the parapet, was now shaking under repeated grenade blasts. The defenders stationed there were exhausted, bleeding, trembling. An Austrian partisan took a bullet to the shoulder and fell back, screaming in pain, leaving a gap in the defensive line. 2 French prisoners rushed to plug it, firing downward even as bullets snapped past their ears and chipped stone flung into their faces. The pressure was relentless. Every defender felt the weight of it in their bones. Then, the SS brought up a new weapon, A Panzerfaust team emerged from the smoke near the central slope, firing straight at the Sherman tank. Lee saw it too late. He shouted for the crew to take cover, but the Panzerfaust fired, a skreek of fire and smoke that struck the tank's side with devastating force. The explosion ripped through the Sherman, blowing open part of the armor plate, engulfing the machine in flames. The crew scrambled out, coughing and staggering, soot-streaked and half-blind. One man collapsed in the courtyard. Another stumbled toward Lee, falling to his knees. The tank, their steel guardian, was now a burning wreck. The defenders lost not only their heaviest weapon, but also the psychological anchor that had kept their courage from collapsing. The SS roared with triumph. They surged harder. Bullets tore through the courtyard in horizontal sheets. Defenders ducked behind stone, but cover was diminishing. The castle, ancient and resilient, was beginning to crack beneath the modern storm. Then the worst breach occurred. A massive explosion tore through the southwestern wall. A satchel charge planted earlier had finally been detonated. The wall buckled, stones raining into the courtyard. Dust swallowed everything, and through that churning cloud, SS soldiers poured in. They had breached the castle. The defenders scrambled backward, firing wildly into the smoke. Lee screamed for them to fall back to the inner courtyard. Gangel ordered his men to form a secondary defensive line. The French prisoners grabbed whatever weapons they could and retreated deeper into the fortress. The wounded limped or were carried inside. The defenders were still fighting, still resisting, but the tide had turned. The SS had entered Castle Itter itself. Gunfire erupted inside the courtyard as figures materialized from the smoke. An American soldier tackled an SS attacker to the ground, wrestling over a knife. A resistance fighter fired his last round point blank into an enemy's chest before being struck by a burst of MP-40 fire. A Wehrmacht defector clubbed an attacker with the butt of his rifle only to be stabbed in the side. The fighting became close quarters, brutal, chaotic. Lee saw it all, saw the defenders buckling under the weight of sheer numbers, saw the SS seizing the castle inch by inch, saw the wounded piling up. And then he saw something that made his heart stop. Major Josef Gangel standing exposed in the courtyard, firing his rifle directly at an SS squad attempting to flank the defenders. Gangel was alone, visible, vulnerable. "Gangel, get down!" Lee shouted. But it was too late. A sniper shot cracked. Gangel jerked violently and fell to the stones, blood pooling beneath him. For a heartbeat, time froze. The German officer who had betrayed the SS to save civilians, who had defended Castle Itter with courage and conviction, now lay dying in the courtyard. Defectors screamed his name. Austrian partisans surged toward him. French prisoners shouted in horror. Lee himself felt a surge of grief so fierce it seemed to punch the breath out of his lungs. But there was no time to mourn. The SS were inside. The castle was falling, and the defenders had only minutes left before they were overrun entirely. Lee stumbled back, shouting orders, rallying anyone who could still fight. The defenders tightened their grip on the inner courtyard, forming a desperate circle of resistance. They were out of ammunition. They were out of strength. Many were wounded. And the SS, sensing victory, pressed forward with a bloodthirsty roar that shook the castle's foundations. The crisis point had been reached. Castle Itter was moments from total collapse. Unless a miracle arrived, the defenders were doomed.
The defenders of Castle Itter were down to their final breaths, backs pressed against the inner walls, weapons nearly empty, bodies bruised, bleeding, and exhausted. Smoke choked the courtyard, stinging eyes and burning lungs. SS soldiers pressed relentlessly into the collapsing fortress, their shrill shouts echoing off the stone with murderous intensity. The medieval stronghold, battered by grenades, punctured by bullets, and shaken by explosions, felt as though it were groaning under the weight of centuries and the final, terrible assault attempting to consume it. And yet the defenders, this impossible coalition of Americans, Wehrmacht defectors, Austrian resistance fighters, and French political prisoners, refused to break. They formed a rough, desperate line around the wounded and the remaining defensible entry points. They fired what few bullets they had left. They swung rifles like clubs when the ammunition was gone. They hurled stones, furniture, debris, anything that could slow the advancing SS. Every man knew they were seconds from being overrun. Every man could feel the end closing in. The SS, crazed by fanaticism and emboldened by their breach of the walls, surged forward with renewed ferocity, climbing over fallen comrades, pushing through smoke, crawling across rubble like wolves closing in on wounded prey. And then, at the very moment when defeat seemed not just likely, but mathematically inevitable, something changed in the air. It began as a faint vibration, so distant and subtle that the defenders mistook it for the ring in their ears from too many explosions. But then it grew louder. A deep, rhythmic pounding that resonated through the ground itself. A sound that did not belong to rifles or machine guns or grenades. A sound that carried weight, steel, momentum. A sound that belonged to engines. Not one engine, but many. The defenders, adrenaline blind and focused solely on survival, barely registered it at first, but the SS did. In the midst of their frenzied assault, a few attackers paused, turning their heads toward the valley below. Another beat followed. Then another, louder, heavier. The ground trembled. The very air seemed to shudder. And suddenly, the distant horizon, visible through gaps in the collapsed walls, flashed with movement. Vehicles. Big ones. Engines revving in coordinated formation. Treads grinding earth and stone. The sound of liberation. Before the defenders could understand what they were hearing, gunfire erupted, not from the SS, but from the valley. A long, stuttering burst, then another, then a deafening roar as multiple 50-caliber machine guns opened fire from below, sending tracers streaking upward like angry comets. The SS paused, stunned by the unexpected barrage. A few shouted warnings, others looked around in confusion. The defenders of the castle, Lee, the Americans, the defectors, the Austrian resistance fighters, the French political prisoners, felt a shock of disbelief that bordered on hallucination. And then they heard it clearly. American voices, American engines, American firepower. Reinforcements had arrived. The 142nd Infantry Regiment of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division, alerted by fragments of radio transmissions, by gunfire reverberating across the valley, and by the urgent reports of scouts, had mobilized into the Tyrolean mountains at breakneck speed, guided by the unmistakable echo of battle. They had expected scattered SS remnants. They had not expected a fortress siege. But the moment they saw Castle Itter under attack, smoke rising from the battlements, gunfire crackling like lightning, they understood the stakes. They formed their lines, they raised their weapons, and they opened fire with overwhelming force. The SS assault buckled instantly. Caught between two enemies, defenders above and American reinforcements below, their formation shattered. Machine gun nests on the lower slopes were obliterated within seconds. Infantry squads were torn apart by 50-caliber bursts. Mortar teams scrambled and fell as mortar tubes exploded in their hands. The forest ignited with muzzle flashes as American infantry advanced up the slope in staggered formations, firing relentlessly, shouting battle commands, moving with the confidence of men who had fought through France, Belgium, and Germany and knew how to break an enemy line. The SS tried to regroup. Officers screamed orders. Squad leaders pushed their men toward the castle, urging them to complete the assault before the Americans could reach the walls. But the defenders, suddenly electrified by the sound of friendly fire, surged forward with renewed fury. Lee fired his last remaining rounds into the breach, dropping 2 SS soldiers before his rifle clicked empty. He tossed it aside, grabbed a fallen weapon, and kept firing. Wehrmacht defectors, fighting not just for survival but for redemption, charged forward, driving the SS back from the inner courtyard. Austrian partisans shouting in German and Tyrolean dialect swept the battlements and fired into the backs of retreating attackers. For a moment, the castle became a storm of chaos. Gunfire in every direction, smoke rising in thick columns, debris raining from above. Dead and wounded soldiers lay scattered across the courtyard. The defenders were exhausted beyond measure, but they fought with the desperation of men who had just glimpsed salvation. Jean Boutrata, despite his injuries, pushed himself to his feet and stumbled to a window, firing downward at SS stragglers. The French prisoners cheered through tears of exhaustion and disbelief. Paul Renault helped drag wounded men into safety. Daladier supported a limping American rifleman. Gamelin directed defenders toward the points of collapse, barking orders with military precision he had not exercised in years. The SS wavered. Their screams lost momentum. Their formations broke apart. And then panic swept through them like wildfire. The 1st American half-track crested the rise below the castle, 50-caliber machine gun thundering, spent casings cascading like metallic rain. Behind it came infantry squads advancing with bayonets fixed, firing controlled bursts, moving like a tide of iron and discipline. The SS, fanatics though they were, could not withstand an attack from both sides. Their courage crumbled, their fanaticism dissolved. Those still alive turned and fled toward the forest, abandoning weapons, comrades, and the final objective they had fought so viciously to obtain. A few attempted to hold their ground, firing back at the Americans. They were cut down within moments. The rest scattered like frightened animals. The battle was broken. The defenders felt the tide shift instantly. The pressure on the walls evaporated. Gunfire diminished. Screams faded. The smoke began to clear. The courtyard fell quiet, except for the distant rumble of American engines and the final, sporadic pops of rifles as U.S. infantry hunted down the last remnants of the SS force. Jack Lee stood amid the wreckage of the siege, blood on his hands, soot on his face, his uniform torn, his body shaking with exhaustion. He took in the devastation, the shattered wall, the burning Sherman tank, the wounded defenders lying on blankets and rubble, the dead, both friend and enemy. And then he saw the American infantry pouring into the lower courtyard, officers shouting for medics, soldiers helping wounded defenders to safety. They had survived. Against all logic, against overwhelming odds, against a force larger, better armed, and filled with fanatic hatred. They had survived. But survival came with cost. In the center of the courtyard, surrounded by defectors and partisans, lay Major Joseph Gongol, still, pale, and undisputably gone. Lee walked to him slowly, kneeling beside the fallen German officer. The defenders gathered in silence. Even the newly arrived Americans paused, sensing the weight of the moment. Gongol had been the catalyst for the entire defense. His courage, his betrayal of the SS, and his determination to protect the innocent had made the alliance possible. He had died defending French prisoners and fighting alongside American soldiers. He had died with honor. Around them, medics treated the wounded. French prisoners embraced one another with exhausted relief. The Austrian resistance fighters wept openly. Wehrmacht defectors, now uncertain of their fate, sat quietly, mourning their commander. And above them, the ancient towers of Castle Itter, blackened, cracked, but still standing, seemed to bow under the emotional weight of the battle they had just endured. As the dust settled and reinforcements secured the area, the defenders were gathered outside the castle to account for survivors. Only a few had died, astonishingly few given the scale of the attack. Every French prisoner survived the battle. Every American, Austrian, and most of the Wehrmacht defectors lived. The SS dead littered the hillside in grim testimony to their fanaticism. The castle, though battered, had held. The Battle of Castle Itter, the strangest, most improbable battle of World War II, was over. Enemies had become allies. Allies had become brothers. And history had witnessed something it would never see again. American soldiers, German Wehrmacht defectors, Austrian partisans, and French political prisoners fighting together against a common enemy. A final stand born not of strategy or politics, but of shared humanity. And in the end, that humanity had prevailed.